Good afternoon, everyone that have met here in the auditorium. Christine Ruiz Picasso from the Picasso Museum, Malaga, and to everyone that is following us. A special greet to those, and I see many faces here, that have been following us throughout these 5 sessions, and that in addition we have had the opportunity to dialogue, to reflect and to share ideas, not only inside this auditorium, but also in the coffee breaks. These Wednesdays in October, all of them have been focused in addressing surrealism, a movement that emerged with the first Surrealist manifesto 1 century ago, and that from there has had a journey with differences, influences, complexity, passing through the look of Pablo Picasso as well. In the name of the museum, I would like to thank again all those who have been made possible this seminar, technicians, the team of the museum, the interpreters, and above all, to each of the speakers that have shed light during these sessions on surrealism or the surrealisms. In this edition, under the edition From New York to Picasso, we are lucky to, or I am lucky to introduce 2 speakers that are intimately related with this museum. They are Michael Fitzgerald and Miguel López Remiro. I would like to thank Unicaja Foundation as well, which is sponsoring the seminar, and the University of Malaga, that is always willing to cooperate in our projects, cultural and educational projects. And I can see here the students attending today. Going back to our 2 speakers, Michael Fitzgerald and Miguel López Remiro, I would like to make a brief journey on their curriculum, although I think that you all know them. Michael Fitzgerald is Professor of the History of Art of the Trinity College of Stratford and Director of the Foundation Bernard Picasso for the Art. He has been the curator for a number of exhibitions, between others, Pablo Picasso, Structure of Invention, Unity of Work, that you can enjoy in this museum. If you don't know it yet, I encourage you to visit it. In addition, he has published several books linked to the work of Picasso, among them Picasso, the Artist Studio. Miguel López Remiro has a degree in economy and doctor in philosophy, aesthetics and history of art from the University of Navarre. During his career, he was the editor of the first anthology of texts of Rothko, and recently he has been a professor of the European University of Madrid, has been sub-director and curator of Guggenheim Museum in Picasso, and director and founder of the Museum of the University of Navarra. And we are lucky that he's our artistic director. Thank you to both, and thank you again for all the people who are attending. And we start with Miguel López Remiro with his presentation, Terra Incognita, that deals with the surrealist years in the city of New York.
Muy buenas tardes. Para mí es
Good afternoon. For me, it's a great pleasure as the artistic director to offer this conference. I thank all my team. As Maria Jose said, I would like to thank all of you that are part of this great museum. It's an honor to work as artistic director and give I speak about Mouth Rothko, my area's specialty, and this conference is it's a great opportunity. I know that many of you that feel they look desperately for those silence where to take roots. In 1969, Mouth Rothko receiving the doctorate in Yale University, a university that he abandoned in the 20s, with the search of an artistic path that he couldn't look in the university. Those words of looking space, I thought they were an allegory to start a conference that speaks an unknown space, an unknown terra incognita as an artist. That is talking my old me of Rothko of the 20s, in 69 before he died, addressing that youth. The public we have here with us, you are young people looking for spaces where to put your roots in and grow. And the work for the museums and the universities and the artists, in fact, is to look for spaces, terra incognitas, unknown lands where to grow. And I believe that it's interesting to dedicate this conference precisely to those of you that establish pockets of silence, unknown lands for others, from parents, from educators, from museums, from universities, from galleries, etc. This is for you. The term terra incognita is a term used many years ago, 150 after our era, approx by Claudio Ptolomeo. It's a term that translates regions. In sessions, we have used cartographies of Surrealism and other maps, and using an allegory, using a map from the 16th, 17th, that continues to record these unknown lands, pointed out by Ptolomeo to talk about borders unknown that explorers couldn't find or discover. Years later, generators later, cycles later, we used this allegory to talk about the intellectual spaces unexplored. And Robertson, a curator known by this house, he gave the first speeches of the history of this museum that is 22 years old this week. He retook this item to talk about this unknown land in the abstract American art, and specifically to talk about the surreal paintings of Rothko in the 30s and the 40s, a space unknown, allegoric. Robson used it in Terra Incognita concept and a place unfound, non-explored by official history of the art, but explored by Gorky, Pollock, Newman, that were in the path of this triumph of the American painting in the 30s and the 40s, after this exile of the surrealists into New York, established a cartography of modern art unexpected by the official history of the arts. We all read, those of us studying the 20th century art, the American abstract extension. We read the Triumph painting, the books of this, the American painting, and we have also tackled concepts such as the supposed transfer or stealing of by New York of the history of the arts in relation to Paris. It seemed that there was a big bang, an explosion of triumph, where there is this new form of American painting that had nothing to do with the past, that was not interlinked with the history of the avant-garde. However, as I will explain all my speech, I will highlight the items of this big bang. This was not as such. It was triumphalist. It was not local and not isolated. It was the opposite. We generated a historiographic myth, but I think that linked to other speeches that we had in the last weeks, that canon of the new American paint comes from the melting, from the metamorphosis and transformation, how the influences assimilated by the surrealists and their stay in New York made that space into a new place where we found a new way of making paintings. but we went far from the triumphalist position to go into the metamorphosis, to get closer to the reality of an art that emerged from the encounters with the European Afghans. The story that concerns us situates us in the city of New York, a city that we all know, we know the skyline, a picture of the 30s, of the 40s, could direct us on which geographical space we were talking about, what cartography we were mentioning in this city. A city that couldn't be stopped in constant growth. And that city in the artistic field look from far the beginning of the 20th modernity to become the heart of the avant-garde. And this is true. The background geographically moves because of the Second World War, the exile of surrealists from Paris and from Europe, escaping the Nazi horror of the war to move to other free surroundings. And we saw in other conferences, they established a new symbolic campus in the Caribbean and other spaces. But New York was one of the hearts for many reasons. It consolidated as the most important one. That space of avant-garde of the beginning of the century was situated to reduce, and don't want to be reduced, but to explain it as a summary between pictorial trend looking for a cultural pathos situated maybe in the regionalism, the more American one, and in the social realism, and with a provincial nature, with all my respects to all but the periphery or the perimeter coming from the centralities. There was this reference to the social realism we see in this painting, but there was also a part that could be considered more academic and that could try to go out of the provincialism. But those years were determining in the history of economy and of sociology. And I think we could discuss this with Professor Michael Fitzgerald, what the crack of 29 meant, a financial crack that locates US in a place of double depression with the financial crisis that put down all the national optimism and everything that was happening or was about to happen in Europe, and that will have an effect, a powerful effect on America itself. Something happened very interesting from the situation from economical crisis and 29th crack depression. The federal government supported visual arts. This is one of the signs through an endowment of they decided to support their own artists. And this is a contradiction in the avant-garde's development, because without that support from the government, it will have been very difficult to think about Rocky, Rothko, and Roth Gottlieb to follow the creative path. Others have a more advantageous position because of the financial, but others had to use these creativity federal funds. The 29th crisis and the next 10 years introduced an opening vector. Teachers like Weber and Milton Eyre opened windows towards the new forms. And this network of museums and galleries emerging in the 29, MoMA opened, the Whitney, the Guggenheim a bit later, but there was a proposal of a non-objective art by Hilary Bates, as we will see later on. Establish a network of museums that coincides with this kind of cultural humus supported by the government, with these Europeans arriving non-stop to the city of, and they established a playing ground, a new pathos where artists in America found a path for growth, which was spectacular. MoMA, Cézanne, Serrat, Van Gogh, Matisse, there were exhibitions about Cubism, about the Bauhaus, especially about the Surrealism. This is the fantastic art of Surrealism of the 36 intensive workshop on modernity of that generation US, curated by André Breton with a twin, as it appeared in the presentation leaflet, who was Marcel Duchamp. It was not only MoMA, there was only the Whitney Museum, the prototype of museums, also known as Guggenheim, who was firstly known as non-objective art museum, and all that secret of galleries, of curators, of collectors, that generated from that richness all that spaces of possibilities. And in that context, the European people in exile arrived. This is a curious picture. We can see some of them. Relevant figures as all looking in both directions, generating a kind of visual game that is quite allegoric. And there was a new way of thinking that arrived, as automatisms centering the subconscious and as the revelation methods. And in Europe, there was this automatism strategy of rupture, and it transforms in US. American abstracts, that's very interesting. This new generation of painters that see how all this frenzy arises from Europe through the exile. These big artists, very with a lot of reputation, with exhibitions and collections that were really relevant. They had an effect on that generation. There's a kind of frenzy on the return. So US found sources, US artists, the method, the primary sources, the processes in the conversation with the artists in their homes. Artists from Europe found sources of imagination that really fed their own idea of surrealism. And I think it's interesting to project pictures of Mark X surrounded by totems of North America, primitive art as well, we can say it cautiously, non-Occidental art, and that was deeping inside of the archaic deepness of this land that we're visiting, or they were colonizing in one way, in brackets. So that creates a conceptual churning that supports the conceptualists in the discovery of a new land, an incognita, a terra incognita. Leger went back to Paris. In US, nothing has limits. He used to say, everything is big, everything is a great landscape. And Marx is finding these figures that he traded with and trafficked with. It was a telluric force unexpected. In the Caribbean, it happened, and in other places around the world, how the surrealists in that process almost of invasion, of metamorphosis, of covering spaces that could find places of sources of unexpected inspiration. And this dynamic of the primordial, the automatist, telluric found in US, a space that became the cultural humus. And that double churning, the affecting of young American artists and these senior artists being also in the subconscious of their surrealist imagination affect is very, it's like a paradox, it's an ambivalence, a double way of affecting the reality that take us to metamorphosis, that how processes artistically are not random. They come from the melting, from the mixing, for all this surrealist preponderance consolidated that finds in New York a new source of inspiration. And this is something that should inspire us. Some paintings or pictures of the exhibitions I was mentioning. And something really important is the chapter of the critical apparatus surrounding the whole of New York School. All movements in the arts goes to the critics, and this ecosystem created in New York with collectors, with museums, with this background and this welcoming, and with the critical media, the View Nation Possibilities T-side, where Rothko wrote a very important manifest called Romantics Felt the Need, establishes a space, another land, another landscape of high voltage from the critics. This context, theoretically, or theory of the art, that usually goes hand in hand with the emergence of artistic movements. There are two key figures in this American time, Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg, two great theoreticians of the philosophy of the arts that established two very opposite positions to understand the New York School. Greenberg, a Kantian formalist inclination, looking for this Rothko's Pollock, William de Koning, and other artists defended how the new in the American painting, in interaction with the Surrealist, was this ambition to find the essential shape, and paint was only paint, nothing else. Sculpture was only a sculpture. There was nothing, no space to deceive the observer, and painting should reflect that material land of painting itself, and the sculptor had to focus on looking for the shapes and the space. And this Greenberg trend, formalist trend, often criticized, I believe it has a reality when understanding the abstract expressionism and American painting. It's interesting to see as well as a counterpoint, Rosenberg, he started to speak about the abstraction field as a game playing ground. He does almost a performance within a painting. Pollock as someone that doesn't even touch the canvas. Like the painting is like an arena, a place where you have like a dance happening. It's the other side of this alleged trio of American painting. But those two positions, we can make them play with different fields of surrealism, and we can mix concepts. The theory of the arts brings keys, but they are not all the solutions that could give us the truth. Both positions, I think, are very interesting. Other theologians made statements that were more of confrontation. This Johann Graham theologian talk about this confrontation about the French painting in a frontal way. It was the time of the American painting, American art, to act allegedly like if it was a biological process of transformation, replace the postulates of surrealism. I don't think it's like that. In confrontation was not necessary because all of them had similar sources of inspiration. So the cultural homos that we can imagine in New York, let's think about the history and how it's rewritten from a vision of the meaning of terra incognita that can be foreseen. This metamorphosis implicit in all transformation process and movement in the world of the arts. It's obvious that the arrival of the Europeans is for the artists in US a possibility. In the same way that for the surrealists it's a possibility to meet a new field of work. Despite America being a refuge from the horror of US and that of Europe, we have to point out the three vectors that from surrealism can help us to understand the reality of abstract, especially the School of New York, the New American Art. It's not only New York. Clifford Steele is another American expression that was in the West Coast of US, for example. And this is in this triangle we wanted to represent this triple pyramid: the automatism on one side, the admiration towards the natural, and the search of a mythical art with universal subjects. These fundamentals promoted from the New York School, as we can see through this presentation in detail. If we stop in automatism, if we think in some conferences we saw with Manuel Guigon, Breton in his 24 manifesto, as Maria said, we have overcome these 100 years. We are in the 101 years of the surrealism. Art was pure psychical automatism. The Dominguez Deca-Communists are a wonderful example. The exquisite cadaver, other games of surrealism that went to a methodology of the subconscious. By US and in this American art, these different cartographies, these places, these continents, this idea extends. It's not an automatism, and keeping in mind a Pollock painting, this develops and psychoanalyzes. The American painting is not a Freudian protocol anymore. It becomes a lantern of an artist's process. And there's a simultaneity between the creation and the invention. And this, far from being a novelty, connects us with ideas of the old philosophy, with Kafka, with Aristotle, where art auto-discovered itself in a germinal theory of the artistic, where automatism and the artist follows not only this Freudian subconscious, but an inertia of the creative impulse to try to find the originary model. Well, with irony mentioned, if we did doodles or scribbling to translate this New York school model, well, we did it to the 16 scale chapel, and this exclusive caliber that they propose in the American abstract expressionism has a visual that is colossal in its size. There are other cracks that appear. Automatism as a channel of opening of the subconscious surrealism is translated by these New York people as something that can be linked to the presence. Hand follows an internal proceeding, and this is biomorphic theory. The thesis emerges because of a kind of need, and the automatism is a fate, a search over the immanent. I remember Cabo Sevalier talking about somebody that is not expression of such as that comes from this path, describing as the last, just to find the resources that are fundamental of what becomes art in presence. So American abstracts in this new painting are opposed to going to the dream field like Surrealists did. Art was an exploration of an unknown land, and you had to explore it. The second vector, and we can see this Pollock painting that can help us in the same, is this allusion of the abstracts and of the surrealist to the relevance of nature onto the primitive. The surprise of the exile on this unexplored, of this leisure, there in US, everything has no limits, is a kind of encounter with a place. And we were talking about that with Mr. Fitzgerald, of a land which is a continent and produces an impact that is tremendous in these artists. But the American abstracts start to find in this vision of the natural a trend that is different. Pollock said, "I am nature." And if the abstracts are tackling nature as a context where there is almost a symbiosis of the artist with the nature, it comes maybe from ideas of the surrealists, but transformed that became something related to the immanence, to the permanence, with the telluric again.
And this shift towards that character of the natural, of the automatism, drives us to the last vector, which is the character of myth. Surrealists had supported the myth from the New Yorkers, if you allow me this expression, finding the myth, not escaping from the present, who some surrealists could have stated as such, an oniric world, to be able to escape from the trauma, or to find a rational space to understand the art. But it's this same allusion to the dreamlike sphere is for annihilation to attain the universal and the natural in a convulsion of the society. We are in a moment of social, political, and transformation. That shift to the mythic by the School of New York, having as main representatives Kate Rothko, start talking about the capacity of the artist to generate a good painting as long as it's related with a subject matter. That becomes the radical key for all the American abstracts. Rothko started to talk that they were myth makers. They created myths. Not only they tackle the myth in its different forms, but myth becomes the background, a representation of themselves. They are creators of myths. The archaic establishes a language, and what they were searching in that language, as they had seen in other societies, and I can say that in the past, even classic philosophical, Greek classical, they found the representation of a fiction that allow a human being understand another human being in action. the representation of the man in action through a fiction that makes us understand that how we are human beings in the world through artifacts. And this is what this beginning School of New York was aiming at. Remember that in 1903, Rothko was born. He emigrated to the United States later, and at the end of the 40s, he was already a reputed artist with an intellectual capacity which was outstanding, and that have left a trace as an artist which is spectacular. Some of the works that allow us to see the mixture between the real, the mythological, the natural, and we can anticipate maybe some vectors of the subsequent painting, which is separated by fragments, where there is a substitution of figures with other characters, with a representation of pure color, avoiding this Grimmenian surrealism. Now the character becomes the viewer. I thought it was a good idea to have another picture of the group of the North American abstracts. We can see Cleaver Steele, de Kooning at the right of the image with that powerful gaze. All these artists were looking for a symbol, and they were generating something that it was a breakup. As I have said, this terra incognita, this process of the surrealist in exile and the origin of the School of New York is the culmination of decades of rehearsal. We have to omit that triumphalist vision, the training stages of North Americans, and to understand how the surrealists found in New York a source of inspiration. What there is a cartography, a mixture cartography, process of metamorphosis that have been going on throughout all human life, but there is moving from one continent to the other, and the horror of the Second World War and what it involves worldwide in the history of the world, what involves for European artists in exile to a new continent to generate another space. And in addition, the surrealist artists finding in that occasion a new vision. And I think by that mixture, we can see a new type of painting, a new space, a new focus, almost liturgic, that fixes us in a frontal experience before the work of art, and that establishes a new limit in the pictorial space. This is a picture of Mark Rothko on the 20s. He was born in Minsk, Lithuania. In that time, Russia, immigrated to the United States, escaped from the persecution of the Jewish. He sets up there, and he has a grant, and he spends 2 years studying and in jail, and he escapes the university, if we can say so, to become an artist. In the first place, an actor, and I think it has a paradigmatic reflection on his work, and he's interpreting the pictorial work as an intermediation task. The paintings I was showing that were showed before has a brutal impact on his consolidation as an artist. When he went to visit a friend who was portraying a nude, he decides to become a painter. Just at the time, he sees a friend of his portraying a nude, and it's later, a little bit later than this picture. The thought of Rothko is very wide. It's an aesthetic thought of great dimension. For Rothko, the painting is established as an adventure in an unknown world, a different way of seeing the artistic. He rejects academics. There is a new way of understanding art. And during all that decade of the 30s and 40s. I would like to show you some pictures of his visions of the human figure that he starts doing in the 30s, or the landscapes of the city of New York, and above all underground, which I find very interesting at the time of understanding urban surroundings. It seems he was trying to find the roots through these pictures. The figure appears from the beginning of his portrait and his artistic career, but as I said before, that process almost of transformation is influenced, as it happened to all the painters of American generations, by the European surrealists of the years of the 40s. And it's clear to think that works such as The Omen of the Eagle, 1942, is completely related with, for example, Max Ernst and some other artists, the apparition of the space, biomorphic, mythic space that has to do with the nature, with the representation of something unattainable, something which is dreamlike, is something that we can all consider, see. Another of the picture, we see that there's achieved from a figuration and biomorphic representation, and it culminates with the multiforms at the end of the 40s. Rothko is influenced by all the surreal current lived in New York, but decides with other artists of the school not to abandon a biomorphic path, but substitute it or organizing other ways of understanding the artistic. He keeps presenting myths that do not appear in a described manner. His paintings stop having titles. There is myths which are represented by spaces in which we can anticipate classic forms of Rothko. So I say again that it's a metamorphosic process. If surrealists have supported the natural, the biomorphic, the past, Rothko starts doing the same with all that range of paintings that emerged in the 40s in a more dissolved manner, establishing a new boundary. The creatures start settling in fields of color, those multiforms, the forms which I like comparing with watercolors. He's getting inspired by the method of watercolor, something liquid, which is expanding over the limits of the paintings, establishing a new visual field. And the subject matter is not negotiable. For Rothko, there is a good painting on nothing. The subject matter is something you cannot renounce to, and the timeless of the same is something that has to be touched on constantly. The method is presence, and the framework is ritual, archaic and Byzantine art. For him, show that the image can fix a community in a presence manner. Art becomes presence. For modern art, for Rothko and other artists, must invent equivalents with figures that incarnate. So that's why he starts frontality, economy of the painting, always comparing so that the painting becomes a place, not a decorative object. The size of the works as well. If we think of the work at the beginning of the 40s, we can see that something would remain from his work. The exploration of the myth, it doesn't disappear. The exploration of nature doesn't disappear. The exploration of myth doesn't disappear. Everything transforms and is substituted. She has a very well-known phrase. He didn't eliminate the figure from his paintings. If we see this, and if we think about the succession of layers and of cubes, quadrangles, he says that he hadn't eliminated the figure, but substituted with a figure of the viewer himself, trying to understand what he sees. From the 50s, and this is the classic stage of Rothko establishes a canon that few artists I know have been able to do. There's constance. Maybe Picasso did do it. There is a constant awareness, and we see here in the Michael Fitzgerald explanation of the unity of the work, there is the biomorphic, the natural appear constantly in the paintings of Rothko, but even if the forms are substituted, there is a constant awareness in the language. But clearly, when one give a lesson on Rothko, yes, in these paintings of the 50s, of color with a succession of layers repeated during 20 years with different colors that we know on the later stages of his life are more dramatic, more obscure. Maybe the emblem of this chapel of Rothko in Houston. Rothko substitutes, alters, but always the figure. And I love thinking that what he was claiming was the performative sphere with the, the desire to be an actor, so that the painting is a landscape in which one enters, establishing a tension, dialogue, tensionate dialogue with a space of color in which being able to activate in the manner perceived by the artist a language with the work of art. After that, behind that serenity, there is a rigorous structure of thoughts. He conceives art as an ethical experience, not only aesthetic. And I think it's something that make him differ from the other artists. It's a space of shared presence, a sort of secular communion between the spectator and the work. In his words, is a living organism that live because of partnership, because of company, and it died with the same coin. He rejected the explanations and the anecdotes of the surrealists. He didn't like art historians at all. It's true, and we talk about it at lunch. There are other artists that rejected historians. He didn't think, he rejected that vision of painting as something that evolves. He understood the artistic as a constant awareness of the human, and the conception of the artist being able to generate a symbol as a response to the reality surrounding it, generating a myth so that some others can understand their position in the world. Within that transition period of this Europe that goes into exile in the United States, Rothko keeps a singular place. He's an artist that makes painting becomes a middle ground between the real and the human. Paintings which are silent and dense are inhabited, and before it there is no narration or explanation, always only an experience. We were talking as well at lunch. There is a exhibition of Whitney of Surrealism in the 16th. Maybe Surrealism has never ended, inhabited in the School of New York in a marvelous way. So what remains from the myth promoted by the Surrealists in the United States, how was it transformed by North American artists, that metamorphosis, that mixing? I was talking about the response is that the color, the light, and the space of breath remained, and Rothko wanted in that space, in that immanence, that in the history of the art we could go back to Aristoteles, Platon, Sophocles, how myth established a fiction which is a playground in which the viewer essays through his critical eye, his own position through the world, through an art in the world, through an artifact created by an artist, to end with the complete journey of Rothko. This painting that is marvelous for me. Sometimes when we see the portrait of an artist, to approach a person, someone as Rothko, we can understand him from a photograph on a moment where he's moving some of his canvases The self-representation of that character tell us about a magic artist. He transformed automatism into conscious. Myth became light, and he generated a narration, which is a direct experience. It's a path he created from the visual, from the evolution of Rothko himself. We go into the path that sums up the character of pilgrimage of North American artists, which are imbued by the European set up there and established a sort of communion that is left for history as a teaching of metamorphosis and mixing. Rothko and his contemporaries doesn't break up with the past, but transforms modernity. He receives, take the surrealist as a powerful drive to generate something new. He was an artist that dedicated all his life to open up spaces from the initial figuration we have seen to monochrome representations. How to represent the man in action. His response was the most simple and most difficult, not to represent it, but to make him present, to use postulates from the Surrealism and teaching the methodology, the process to access the subconscious, but not stay in the subconscious to mythology, but to deepen in the existential character of the myth. So that to generate a painting that is nature itself. I think Rothko and all these artists surrounding his journey or his career really use this terra incognita as an artifact. They use the transition times as a place of possibilities, of artistic possibilities, and far from being a space where we'd have to go to make opposite cultures, countries, artistic movements. And there is a picture by Serge Gilbo about the idea of modern art in Paris. If we think that there is no triumph, but metamorphosis and changes constantly happening in the history of university, of universal, we can think of terra incognitas are places of university, of universal. Finding spaces of silence where to grow. He was referring by his character of artist, searching a space where to grow, an humus, a place from which that creation of identity could grow to propose something new, but not as a triumph, but as something humble, as needs surprising that this comes from these words comes from humus, and a noun, land rich in possibilities, his own land and personality of being exiled from Russia in communion with the surrealists of the 30s and 40s that could produce that painting, which is with his fields of color. We can only explore the artistic. We can only think that the metamorphosis process is still on. And I think it's interesting to reflect on everything that has happened in this seminar to actually support the character of metamorphosis and transformation surrounding the history of art and understanding terras incognitas and known lands, the ones we know and don't know, as places in which we maybe have to assume the risk and attempt it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel López Ramiro, for taking us to that terra incognita and keeping us incognita. We are going to have a small break of half an hour to have a coffee. For all of you in streaming, we'll be back at 6:20, more or less. Thank you.
Buenas tardes de nuevo. Retomamos las...
Good afternoon. Again, we resume the second part of this last session by the hand of Michael Mark Fitzgerald with his conference on the surrealism of Picasso through the structures of invention. Thank you.
Good evening. Great pleasure to be back in Malaga at the Musée Picasso and to be able to address you this evening. Thank particularly Miguel Lopez Ramiro and Eugenio Carmona for having organized this conference, and Maria Jose Valverde for making it all actually happen. So I will be speaking in English. I apologize for that. And I will try to speak relatively slowly so that the translators will not be overwhelmed, but I particularly appreciate your contributions, and I look forward to any questions you may have afterwards, after we've had our discussion following my presentation. My charge today is to discuss the exhibition that currently hangs in the galleries of the Palacio in relation to surrealism. Since we are too many to gather there, I urge you to take the ideas that I discuss and bring them into the galleries on your own or in groups and consider them in front of the paintings, drawings, and sculptures. Here are two photographs of the installation. One on the left shows the gallery displaying Picasso's work of the 1920s and 30s, the primary years of his association with surrealism. On the right is the last gallery of the exhibition. As you look at the sequence of works from the 20s and 30s, you will note the variety of styles on view: classical revivals, strict realism, cubism, and radically transformed figures, the diversity of approaches that Picasso combined to create his art between the world wars. I have no doubt that the ideas associated with the Surrealist movement and Picasso's personal relationships with some of the poets and artists of the movement were crucial inspirations for the art he made, both during the primary years of Surrealism and in following decades as well. As previous speakers in this month-long conference have suggested, Picasso's engagement with Surrealism preceded the formal launch of the movement. I would extend this period by suggesting that aspects of Surrealism remained central to his art for decades after the dissolution of the movement. Indeed, they extended to the end of Picasso's career in the works on view in our final gallery. As many of you know, Picasso never formally joined the Surrealist movement, and its founder, André Breton, never specifically claimed Picasso as a member, even though he frequently praised Picasso as an inspiration for the founding of the movement and acclaimed Picasso as the artist whose work continued to define its innovations. I will only be able to touch on Picasso's extremely complex relationship with Surrealism, a movement we will see is best stated in the plural rather than the singular. In probing the issue of visual artists in the Surrealist sphere, we will also be able to expand the range of artists in ways previous speakers have addressed so thoughtfully. Clearly, we're dealing with fascinatingly complex and contradictory questions. I hope that I can lay out some of the issues in ways that will engage you in this remarkably fertile creative mix. Since I have a great deal of territory to cross in 45 minutes, I must begin with an apology. In order to suggest the relevance of Surrealism across not only the primary years of the 1920s and 30s, but through the end of Picasso's career, I will often be obliged to resort to generalities. I hope that my discussion of the remarkable paintings and sculptures in the exhibition will balance this summary treatment of the surrounding history. Before I address the art, I must supply some background. As Neil Cox discussed last week, the story does not begin with André Breton and the formal founding of his Surrealism in 1924, but rather 7 years earlier with Picasso and Guillaume Apollinaire, the great poet, critic, and playwright of the early 20th century, who was probably Picasso's closest friend during these years. Here I'm showing you a drawing Picasso made in 1918, celebrated their shared sensibility. While Apollinaire seems to have invented the term in 1917 to describe the collaboration of Picasso, Jean Cocteau, and Erik Satie on the ballet Parade, even though Picasso sometimes said he was the inventor, Apollinaire's first significant use of the term was in the title of his own play, Les Mamelles de Tiresias, The Breasts of Tiresias, which was first performed soon after Parade premiered. He gave the play the subtitle A Surrealist Drama. Comically inverting the ancient Greek myth of the seer Tiresias, Apollinaire created a tale of a woman named Thérèse who switches her sex to gain power over men while her husband produces over 40,000 babies. While obviously absurd, the play nonetheless addressed issues of female empowerment and the reduced birth rates that were serious concerns during the First World War. On stage, the performance must have been startling. Thérèse prominently exhibits and severs her sex by removing her balloon breasts and bouncing them at the end of strings before exploding them and throwing balls from her bodice into the audience. Thus, Apollinaire created a fantastic portrayal of real contemporary issues, a surrealist drama. Here is the only known photograph of the actors in costume. Although these costumes were designed by Serge Ferrat, an artist in Apollinaire's circle, they clearly mimic Picasso's Cubist designs for Parade, which you see in Picasso's study on the right. If one of the characters in the photo represents Thérèse, Ferrat's synthetic cubism failed to capture her outrageous character. Since Picasso was touring with Parade, he missed the opportunity to collaborate on Les Mamelles, and he may not have been sorry about that. Unusually, his contemporary cubism revealed little interest in the erotic subjects of his earlier work and might not easily have been adapted to meet the provocation of Apollinaire's extravagant combination of burlesque striptease and absurdist satire. Still, he could have revisited his woman in a chemise seated in an armchair, 1913 to 14, which Neil Cox explored so thoughtfully last week. Her pegged-on breasts could have served as a precedent for Thérèse's balloons. As we will see, Picasso had a chance to address Les Mamelles in the 1920s, when his redefinition of surrealism brought new life to Apollinaire's surrealist drama. This photograph of Picasso's drawing both show Apollinaire in his military uniform of 1916. Although his Italian citizenship prevented Apollinaire from being drafted into the French army, he volunteered and was seriously wounded in the trenches in 1916. He died of influenza in November 1918. Inscribed by Apollinaire to Breton, the photograph shows that Breton could lay claim to involvement with Apollinaire in those fertile months before Apollinaire's death. And Breton trumpeted this bond when he announced his resurrection of surrealism in the summer of 1924. However, it's less well known that Breton was not the only friend of Apollinaire who sought to take possession of Apollinaire's word and the ideas associated with it. The summer of 1924 became a battleground, not only over the dead poet's term, but also his significance for contemporary art. And Picasso was at the center of this conflict. It not only defined Apollinaire's legacy for a new generation, it also played a role in shaping Picasso's reputation across the 1920s. This page from a leading contemporary journal documents the furious debate. Picasso landed in the middle of this literary brawl for a totally unanticipated reason. Another ballet, called Mercure, for which he had designed the sets, became the focus of a three-sided debate over the direction of cutting-edge contemporary art. The three main parties were, one, a group of critics and artists who had known Apollinaire and sought to perpetuate what they believed were the principles of his surrealism. Two, Breton and his friends who prompted their redefinition of surrealism by affirming their support of Picasso. And three, artists associated with the Dada movement, most forcefully represented by Francis Picabia, who ridiculed the other two sides, the old friends of Apollinaire, as well as Breton and Picasso. While Picabia's satire of the great masters of art as mere monkeys stopped at Cézanne, his comments published in the Dada journal 391 clearly extended it to include Picasso. Titled A Tribute, the text included the statement that, quote, "I like the music of Mercure very much. Picasso's sets, too. very clearly inspired by Picabia and Duchamp, end quote. And the coup de grace was, quote, Picasso inspires modernist agitation like Paul Poiret. Poiret was a fashionable but not very avant-garde couturier. The vocal support that Breton's surrealists gave Picasso during these months created a bond between them, a bond that was reinforced by Breton's role in convincing Jacques Doucet, another couturier and collector, to buy the Demoiselle d'Avignon. Here is the portrait Picasso made of Breton in 1923 for the frontispiece of his book, Clair de Terre. On the right, you see the Demoiselle installed at the top of the Art Deco staircase in Doucet's home in Paris. As Doucet's secretary, what today we might call his art advisor, Breton was the go-between who convinced Doucet to make the offer to buy the Demoiselle and use negotiations over the purchase to build his relationship with Picasso. In the midst of this series of events, one project slowly took shape. It would build in importance across the remaining years of the 1920s, and it returns us to the question of how the works in our current exhibition engage the ideas of surrealism. As I imagine you have gathered in my discussion, Apollinaire's death in 1918 did not end his relevance for contemporary writers and artists. If anything, his early death increased his importance as a precedent writers and artists could claim to promote their own ideas. So it's not surprising that Apollinaire's friends thought that there should be a permanent commemoration of his contributions. Specifically, they wanted to erect a monument on Apollinaire's tomb in the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. You see the tomb here, adorned with flowers, and a vertical stone carved by Serge Ferrat, the same person who designed the sets for Les Mamelles de Tiresias. He was a member of the committee planning the monument, and he made this marker many years later. The obvious choice to make the monument was Picasso, and surprisingly, he accepted. Until that time, Picasso had not shown any interest in making art for public places, but inspired by Surrealism, this would change across the 1920s and extend into his later work. In 1924, an auction raised money for the tomb monument, and the pressure began to build for Picasso to find a solution to this very traditional form of sculpture, a solution that captured the radical innovations of Apollinaire's work for a new generation. In 1927, Picasso presented his first ideas to the committee of Apollinaire's old friends. We're fairly certain that his proposals included drawings such as this one, and probably this related sculpture, Metamorphosis II, which is on view in the exhibition. The comments of committee members capture their outrage at Picasso's proposals. Quote, Picasso produced a bizarre, monstrous, mad, incomprehensible, almost obscene thing, a sort of unidentifiable lump that looks as though it has sexual organs sticking out of it here and there, end quote. I would say that this is an excellent description of the drawing and the sculpture, Metamorphosis, with its radical redefinition of the female form in constant flux, flowing from the hugely enlarged foot on the right through the bulging masses of its torso into its tiny head. Apparently, everyone at the meeting thought Picasso was ridiculing them, and some of them joked that Apollinaire would have been amused by Picasso's submission. Probably Apollinaire would have been amused, but his colleagues from the war years were not. When you compare Ferrat's costumes of Les Mamelles to Picasso's proposal, you may see why Apollinaire's old friends were shocked. Nonetheless, Picasso's first solution for the monument engaged the sensational imagery of the surrealist drama, particularly its emphatically exaggerated sexuality. In 1927, Picasso took Apollinaire's playful ideas of transformation to a new level by creating creatures whose rampant eroticism overwhelmed what remained of the human figure and repudiated any conventional ideas of social planning. This radical metamorphosis marks the difference between the surrealism of Apollinaire and the surrealism of the 1920s. Here I'm showing you two paintings in the exhibition. The one on the left is from 1927, on the right from 1929. Picasso's exploration of public sculpture did not stop with Apollinaire's tomb. It expanded to include the truly public location of the promenade along the beach at Cannes, where Picasso proposed to locate a series of monumental sculptures like the one in our exhibition. There, the liberated world of the beach, which was so celebrated by the Surrealists, would have been supercharged by the metamorphosing hypersexuality of those giants. Both of these paintings suggest the scale of the monuments Picasso envisioned by filling the space of the canvas with the figures' bodies. Picasso painted the canvas on the left during the same year he made the drawing I just showed you, and the undulating mass of its female figure matches both the drawing and the slightly later sculpture. Picasso turned his rejection of conventional representation into an explosive exposition of a threatening, overwhelming sexuality. The seemingly random gray washes create an impression of confusion and movement within this towering figure that parallels the shifting forms of the sculpture Metamorphosis. In Head on a Beige background of 1929, blocky angularity is the dominant mode of this sharp-edged head with its jagged teeth. In some paintings in the series, Picasso added tiny figures to suggest the monumental size of the sculptures he envisioned. The traditional functions of a monument, celebrating patriotism, social order, or an ideal of human beauty, would have been repudiated by the disorienting size and extreme distortions of these creatures. These monuments would have permanently enshrined the social and imaginative revolution urged by the Surrealists for all to see. As some of you know, Picasso soon proposed another solution for the monument, the wire constructions, linear sculptures of metal rods that were inspired by another of Apollinaire's texts, the autobiographical novel Le Poète Assassiné, The Assassinated Poet. I show you here a drawing by Jean Cocteau that identifies Picasso as the bird of Benin, the artist in Le Poète Assassiné, who creates a tomb monument for the assassinated poet, who is Apollinaire himself. Since the wire constructions are not in our exhibition, I will not discuss this proposal, even though I wrote my doctoral dissertation about it many years ago. Here you see two other views of the Surrealist galleries of the exhibition. The view on the right includes the sculpture Metamorphosis, so you can see how small it is. But remember, it's only a model for the monumental sculptures Picasso hoped to install. I've been suggesting that some of the most extreme innovations of Picasso's art during the 1920s are directly linked to Apollinaire's writings during the last years of the poet's life. If that is true, one might conclude that Picasso bypassed Surrealism, or at least Breton's Surrealism, and that the Surrealism of the 1920s had little relevance for that phase of Picasso's art that is generally described as Surrealist, his art of the 20s and 30s. Indeed, not long ago, some leading scholars of Picasso's work denied that he was influenced by Surrealism. In their view, Picasso's genius was far ahead of the ideas of Breton and his contemporaries. In my opinion, part of Picasso's huge talent, let's put aside genius, was his eagerness to assimilate new ideas across his career, and his exceptional ability to integrate a remarkably wide range of approaches so successfully. In this sense, influence was a virtue. In my view, however, the issue is not really influence, but the response of artists to their environments. That is, artists' active choices to engage or reject ideas. While the events described in Apollinaire's text, Les Mamelles and Le Poète Assassiné, and even specific images do seem to have served as inspirations for Picasso, the vocabulary of forms he employed between the world wars and the psychological exploration of these works has little relationship to Apollinaire's primary themes. To define this difference, we need to delve into Picasso's relationship with Breton's Surrealism, the contributions of Georges Bataille, artists and writers associated with these new definitions of the term. However, since the speakers who have preceded me in past weeks have extensively discussed these varied approaches to Surrealism, I will not rehearse Breton's founding statements or the many modifications and outright departures that developed over the later 20s and across the 1930s. Instead, I will focus on a few of the features that transformed Picasso's art during these years, features that I can explore through works that are in the exhibition. As the exhibition's title, Structures of Invention, the Unity of Picasso's Art, suggests, we examine Picasso's creative processes and attempt to identify continuities across his long career. This approach differs significantly from traditional approaches to his art, which generally divide his work into distinct periods. Instead, we propose that rather than segmenting his production, he constantly added aesthetic options in both conceptual and technical terms. As Picasso said in 1923, different motives inevitably require different methods of expression. Probably, Picasso was not only the greatest collector of visual vocabularies, he was also the greatest alchemist of new forms. In my opinion, Surrealism was one of the most significant methods Picasso adopted, and it continued to be a primary tool for him as he transformed his art through the final decades of his career. I'll try to explain some of the ways that I believe this shifting relationship with Surrealism contributed to his art over the years. In the early years after Breton's launch of Surrealism, Picasso's relationship with the movement developed from Picasso being a revered but detached inspiration for the young poets to Picasso becoming an artist who was himself inspired by the liberation proclaimed by the Surrealists while never formally joining the group. This ambiguous relationship of the great artist to these young revolutionaries is one of the most fascinating aspects of the story and strongly reflects the tension in Picasso's private life and public reputation across the 1920s. Breton built his acclaim of Picasso's achievement on what he considered to be the principles of Cubism, especially its basis in what he called an interior model, the preeminence of the imagination over conventional representation. Here I'm showing you Picasso's man seated in an armchair and the first page of Breton's manifesto, Surrealism in Painting, from the July 1925 issue of La Révolution Surréaliste, with its famous opening assertion, "The eye exists in a savage state." As you can see, Breton chose two of Picasso's Cubist paintings, the Harlequin of 1924 and the Student of 1913, to introduce the subject. Painted in the summer of 1925, 1 year after the Harlequin illustration illustrated by Breton, man seated in an armchair marks a significant transition in Picasso's work from its foundation in Cubism into the new initiatives of Surrealism. While based on principles of Cubism, the composition departs from the comprehensive systems of interlocking planes of late Cubism to introduce unfinish and a sense of spontaneity as manifestations of Picasso's creative process and his disruption of conventional image making. I think this painting is one of the most important in the exhibition, even though it is probably overlooked by many visitors. The painting is composed of distinct layers of pigment, and each layer adds a different manner of representation, all of which finally combine to create a dynamic, coherent composition. The base layer of deep green is so thinly painted in many areas that the white of the ground layer is visible. This undisguised layering is further emphasized by the way Picasso outlined his figural composition. Instead of drawing on top of the green field, he scraped through the green paint to reveal the white ground color underneath. The design of the figure is made by subtracting pigment rather than adding it. Then, Picasso began to fill the facets of the design with opaque pigment, creating a puzzle-like pattern that references Cubism of the previous 10 years. Most important, he chose to leave this puzzle or mosaic unfinished. This is the most interesting feature of the painting. While the image of the man is clearly visible, his lack of completion allows us to look beyond the image of the man to the multiple methods Picasso used to create the painting. By revealing Picasso's working process, the final painting glides along a continuum from rigorous design to spontaneous gesture. As I said in my lecture last October, in conventional terms, it combines classicism and Cubism with the new ideas of Surrealism, the foregrounding of the spontaneous and unpredictable flights of the imagination. 3 years later, Picasso unleashed the calculated spontaneity of a seated man to overwhelm the figure with an apparent frenzy of brushstrokes that seemed to reinforce the violently distorted features of this woman's head. Picasso has greatly expanded the expressive potential of what began as a revelation of working processes to convey the psychological exploration discussed so subtly by Eugenio Carmona last week. If some of Picasso's works from the years around 1930 suggest a profound commitment to spontaneity, his remarks define fundamental differences with Breton's doctrines. Unlike Breton, Picasso always insisted that his art was a likeness of things in the world. He described his surrealism as, quote, a resemblance realer than real, attaining the surreal. In another instance, he said, a painter must observe nature, never confuse it with painting. It can only be translated into painting through signs. The key to understanding Picasso's relationship with surrealism, I believe, is the certainty that Picasso gained while inventing Cubism, that painting was fundamentally an artificial construction that could evoke nature but not directly embody it. Art was essentially different than lived reality, no matter how powerfully it might evoke it, whether the issue was physical resemblance or emotional experience. In contrast, Breton saw Cubism as a route to the unconscious. There was the great divide between them. Picasso never believed that art and life could be joined. His art was always detached, even when it approached the uncontrolled flow of automatism. As he recalled in conversation with François Gillot, quote, during the Surrealist period, everyone was doing automatic writing. That was a bit of a joke, at least in part, because when you want to be completely automatic, you never can. There's always a moment when you arrange things a bit. That doesn't mean it can't be a kind of directed dream, but that is just as far from pure automatism as it is from rational thought, end quote. Picasso walked that fine line between automatism and rational thought. It was the division between fantasy and likeness, between abandoning control and making art. The larger issue here is the proliferating influences of surrealist ideas on contemporary art of the 1920s and 30s, and the diversity of interpretations of its core meaning of liberation, both intellectual and social. Picasso's partial adoption of these principles was not so different from the responses of many other artists in those years and following decades. In this sense, Pierre Naval was accurate when he claimed in 1925 that there was no surrealist painting. His critique focused on the supposedly retrograde tradition of painting itself, but what really mattered was the diversity of approaches that exploded from Breton's attack on conventions of art and society. If you examine the art that the Surrealists promoted through reproductions in their primary journal, La Révolution Surréaliste, and through exhibitions sponsored by the group, it is clear that painting, broadly defined, was the dominant medium, and Picasso was the dominant artist, both in his art of the pre-World War I period and his current work. Here I'm showing you 2 pages from the July 1925 issue of the magazine. Moreover, beginning that issue, we find not only a preponderance of works by Picasso, but also a succession of paintings by Joan Miró, beginning with the Tilled Field and The Hunter of 1924. For the Surrealists, Miró's work embodied the free-flowing imagination and the transformations at the heart of Surrealism, and also the spontaneous or automatic method that was a primary technique of the Surrealists in the early years. Yet, like Picasso's process, the reality of Miró's practice was in conflict with the principle of automatism. As is well known, when Breton saw this painting in Miró's studio in 1925, Breton acclaimed it with the grandiose title, The Birth of the World. The idea being that the washes of paint across the large canvas were generated by a spontaneous creativity so profound that it connected to the origins of all things. Yet we now know that Miró's painting is very much a hybrid work. It combines the loose brushstrokes of the base layer with precisely drawn images of a seated figure, a soaring bird, and a star. Not only are these images rendered with a precision that strongly contrasts with the background of the painting, they are based on a small sketch that Miró had made in preparation for painting the canvas. This premeditation is the opposite of automatism. The painting registers not only Miraut's inspiration by Surrealism, but also his distinct departure from Surrealist rules. In creating this balance, Miraut was not far from Picasso's approach, or indeed the work of other artists related to the movement. While I'm talking about these two Spanish artists who live mostly in Paris, I would like to raise a question that, I say immediately, I cannot answer. Should we define the visual side of Surrealism as profoundly Spanish rather than French? In my opinion, Picasso, Miraut, Dalí, Buñuel were the most innovative visual artists associated with Surrealism in the 1920s and early 30s. I think Man Ray was the only other visual artist who deserves to be placed at that level. Inspired by Breton's concepts, these Spanish artists not only chose subjects drawn from their experiences in Spain and the physical features of Catalonia in particular, but also drew on traditions of Spanish art in defining their individual versions of Surrealism. I hope that some of you will have comments about this question during the discussion following my lecture. As the presentations in this conference and the exhibitions at the Pompidou in Paris and the Metropolitan Museum in New York have shown, scholars have greatly expanded the range of artists we study in relation to Surrealism. Here is the map made by Belgian artists in 1929 of Surrealism's expanding global reach, which Estrella de Diego discussed in her lecture. One of the most important additions to the understanding of Surrealism's impact is the inclusion of women, most of whom had been excluded by scholars' focus on the narrow definition of Surrealism promoted by Breton. In Picasso's case, we have a great example of how much a female artist in Surrealist circles not only contributed to Picasso's art and life, but actually collaborated with him as an artist and taught him techniques that expanded his art as well as enriched her own through intimate contact with his. Of course, that person was Dora Maar. When Maar and Picasso's relationship began in 1935, she was already an established professional photographer. Moreover, she was accepted among the artists sanctioned by Breton as significant members of his Surrealist group. For example, this photograph by Maar, titled Simulator, was included in the International Surrealist Exhibition in Santa Cruz de Tenerife in 1935, an exhibition that also included Picasso's work. Importantly, the mission of the exhibition was not confined to aesthetic matters, but also promoted a revolutionary political message that combined Surrealist revolt with the program of the Communist Party. Maar's involvement in this dual campaign would be important for Picasso's deeper involvement in European politics during the mid-1930s. Here I'm showing you an exchange of portraits between Maar and Picasso through altered photographs. During 1935 to 37, Maar and Picasso's artistic relationship expanded in ways that were equaled by only a few of his professional collaborations with other artists, male or female. Drawing on Maar's expertise with the camera and darkroom and Picasso's mastery of printmaking, they explicitly collaborated to create new pictorial mediums. As Anne Baldassari wrote in her groundbreaking book, Picasso, Life with Dora Maar, quote, Dora Maar and Picasso went so far as to exchange artistic domains for a time, each adopting the other's chosen medium to develop hand-in-hand a photography without a camera and form of photographic painting. Their poetic dialogue, unclouded by such commonplaces as the weeping woman and the genius painter, made them an unrivaled artistic couple in the history of the avant-garde, proving one of the most exacting and genuine exchanges in all modern art. Picasso's 1936 portrait of Maar, Woman with Raised Arms, which is in the exhibition, captures her intense energy. With the wide-open eyes and flying hair, she raises her arms and extends her sharply pointed fingers as if weaving a frenzied spell. The spiraling lines surrounding her body reinforce her vitality, as do the intricate patterns of brilliant colors. Through the mid-1930s, Maar's commitment to political action increased during the Popular Front alliance that included the Communist Party and many writers and artists associated with Surrealism. Her advocacy of radical change through politics and art considerably exceeded Picasso's involvement in these issues and promoted his engagement, particularly after the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. As Picasso acknowledged, he saw Mar as the weeping woman, but this personification was not merely the product of Picasso's projection of his ideas onto Mar. The intensity of her response to the violence, political upheavals of 1937 was real. In portraying Mar as he did, Picasso largely recorded rather than invented her actions. These commitments made Mar one of the catalysts for Guernica, so it should not be surprising that she became, in some ways, a collaborator in the creation of the painting, even though this situation has rarely been addressed. Given the artistic exchange that Picasso and Mar had explored since 1935, it seems likely that they discussed the composition as it evolved. I would say that Mar's influence on Picasso through their shared involvement in photography probably played a role in creating Guernica. After all, they had worked together in black and white for months, the medium that also presented the documentary photographs of the bombing published in newspapers. Mar's sequential recording of the huge painting's development was not necessarily passive, as she probably discussed Picasso's choices with him as they chose the moments to preserve the states of the painting. We now know that Picasso entrusted Mar with painting a central section of the composition, specifically the delicate vertical strokes that cross the body of the wounded horse. These strokes both distinguish the horse and subtly integrate it into the surrounding darkness. In this comparison, you can see the effect of Mar's additions on the impact of the painting. Moreover, Mar told John Richardson that she had been the model for the burning woman on the right side of the composition. If you compare that figure with woman with raised arms, you will find a woman whose agitated pose is a less extreme version of that woman in Guernica. As we expand the roster of artists associated with Surrealism, I think Mar deserves greater recognition, both for her own art and her collaboration with Picasso during the mid-1930s. Having arrived at Guernica, I would like to follow the painting's journey from Paris to the US in 1939 and its near constant exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art until its arrival in Spain in 1981. My purpose is to examine the response of US artists to the painting and to speculate on the possibility that their shared grounding in Surrealism sparked a new dialogue during the last decades of Picasso's career. In addressing this question, I hope to reinforce Miguel Lopez Ramiro's discussion of US artists' relationship to Surrealism. When artists in New York first saw the painting in Valentine de Densing's gallery, they were overwhelmed. Elaine Freed, painter and future wife of Willem de Kooning, later recalled, "We were stunned, really bowled over by Guernica. Bill and I just stood before it, in awe, in wonder, in a kind of terror. We didn't talk for a long time." And Lee Krasner also later spoke about seeing Guernica. She said, "Picasso by then was one of my heroes in painting, but I remember opening the door of the de Densing gallery, walking in, and this thing was just there at the entrance. I turned right around, walked out, circled the block 3 times before I dared walk in and really look at it. That's the effect it had on me." Besides the imagery of the painting, one of its characteristics that most surprised these artists was the degree to which the figures were unfinished in conventional terms. Artists in New York were shocked by Picasso's decision to leave drips of paint running down the canvas and his willingness to leave visible underlying versions of characters, such as the bull's head, in a painting that was so large and public in function. As I've suggested, these stylistic features were rooted in Picasso's responses to the Surrealist acclaim of automatism. He had woven the explicit display of his working process into the meaning of his art, both by allowing it to register his presence as an artist and as a dynamic gesture that could convey a wide variety of meanings on its own. These 2 paintings in the exhibition show how Picasso transformed the Surrealist promotion of uncontrolled spontaneity into a conscious technique of wide application. In Man with an Ice Cream Cone, which Picasso painted in the Mediterranean town of Mougins in 1938 and is in the exhibition. The redrawing of the man's face and hand holding the ice cream cone, as well as the unfinished background, suggests the informal setting of the scene and childlike enthusiasm of the man. However, in Bust of a Woman, which Picasso painted in Nazi-occupied Paris in 1941, the stripped-down anatomy of the woman, painted with thin washes and extensive runs of pigment, seemed to project violence and decay. As Picasso said, he did not literally paint the war, but it was present in his art. By 1961, when he painted Seated Woman with a Hat, Picasso had fully transformed the surrealist automatism into a technique he masterfully manipulated in its own right. The seated woman was only a pretext for fields of pigment and swirling lines that envelop her. Looking at this late work by Picasso, I, and many scholars who study post-war art of the US and Europe, have long wondered whether Picasso's work of the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s might stem from more than a shared heritage in surrealism, but also reflect a dialogue among these artists, for example, Picasso and Willem de Kooning. Certainly, the wartime period saw the emigration of leading surrealists, including Breton, to the US, where they developed direct contacts with artists in New York. And there is little doubt that de Kooning modeled paintings, including Pink Lady of 1944, on the imagery and style of Guernica. Compare the woman in Pink Lady to the mourning mother on the left of Guernica. The most interesting question seems to me to be the possibility of a late exchange. From François Gillot's account of a meeting between Matisse and Picasso in the early 1950s, we know that Picasso saw reproductions of works by Pollock and other abstract expressionists that were sent by Pierre Matisse to his father, Henri Matisse. Interestingly, the two artists stated radically different opinions about the new work. Matisse accepted it as an art beyond his understanding, while Picasso adamantly refused to be superseded. When we come to Boy with the Shovel of 1971, which is one of the final works in our exhibition, I think we can see Picasso harnessing the surrealist's beloved subject of the beach and the freedom to foreground process as an expressive form in itself, which by the end of Picasso's career became one of his most powerful means of expression. Can we only connect Picasso's late paintings with one such as de Kooning's Woman 1 of 1950 to 52 through a shared heritage of surrealism, first given physical form in Picasso's responses during the 1920s and 30s? Or, in addition, does this network of exchanges include a direct dialogue among works created decades later by artists who never met? If so, Picasso characteristically maintained his fundamental attachment to line, while de Kooning used more fluid brushstrokes. In this final slide, I'm substituting another of Picasso's late works, another painting of 1971 called At Work, which depicts an artist, probably Picasso, through an array of dynamic brushstrokes that both define the monumental figure and absorb it into the surrounding field. For both Picasso and de Kooning, the defining issue seems to have been the tension between painting as representation or independent expression. In Picasso's case, that tension was resolved by the act of painting. His slashing strokes literally embody the creativity of the static figure at the center of the canvas. In conclusion, I apologize for having left so many questions unresolved. However, I hope that I've explained a few of the many ways in which surrealism suffused Picasso's art from Apollinaire's invention of the term through Breton's resurrection of it and Picasso's decades-long reinvention of it in his art. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Michael Fitzgerald, por acercarnos el surrealismo a nuestra colección, a la estructura de la invención. la cual, si alguno de los aquí presentes no la conocen, os invitamos a que la visitéis en nuestro museo. A continuación, damos paso a la última mesa redonda de este seminario para profundizar en el tema de hoy, de Picasso y Nueva York, de la mano de Miguel López Remiro, nuestro director, y de Michael Fitzgerald. Para aquellos estudiantes que quieran adquirir el certificado de asistencia al seminario, recuerdo que a la salida esta tarde los podréis recoger. Sin más, os dejo con la mesa redonda. Muchas gracias a todos.
Hablaré en inglés directamente con Michael Fitzgerald. Nos pareció lo más natural para también continuar el diálogo y dar las gracias de nuevo por estar aquí con nosotros. Sí, bueno. Estaba diciendo que voy a hablar en inglés directamente con el profesor Michael Fitzgerald. Nos parecía la forma más natural quizás de continuar la conversación, así que le quería dar las gracias en primer lugar a Michael. I wanted to thank you for such a lecture, which is a continuation of the presentation of the collection. So many topics that you've been developing here appear in the collection show, which I think is also an opportunity for us to reread your presentation of the collection at the galleries we have in the palace. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to share the stage with you.
Okay. So we've been talking, both of us, in this final chapter, this final session of the seminar, and this title, the Nueva York a Picasso, from New York to Picasso, which it was like a metaphor, it was like an allegory, and talking about New York and the geography of New York as a placement. And you talked at the end of the lecture about this tremendous influence of Guernica from 1939 till 1981. Guernica, this huge painting, famous painting from Picasso, a monument for peace and many other things, was there at the MoMA, was there in New York. So I wanted to ask you, and maybe opening the conversation from this idea from New York to Picasso and vice versa, how do you think it affected artists, not just de Kooning, but other artists as Franz Klein, Motherwell, Pollock, and to make this dialogue in connection with my conference, how do you think it affected Rothko?
Oh, I was going to ask you that.
So maybe it's a,
Yes.
two-way question. Two ways.
I guess I can imagine a few things. I don't know. I don't have any specific evidence about what the influence might have been, so I would only be guessing as to what it'd be. Of course, the black and white aspect of it, I think it would be a real possibility. The sadness of the theme, the power of it, the size of it, I think all of those are elements that probably Rothko would have responded to quite importantly in trying to find his own very different way of integrating those ideas into his art.
We've seen in my lecture also these black and white paintings by Rothko he did at the very end of his career, 1969. But I'm sure he was looking to Guernica and the dripping. You mentioned in your conference how Picasso lays down this monument and delivers this, this manifesto in such a way that he offers you as a viewer the possibility of seeing the process. And when you see the black and white paintings, the dark paintings, the black paintings by Rothko, you see also this dripping there. So I guess both the process, but also this theme there in the canvas, which is something that maybe is different from the surrealist. I mean, the theme is there, the myth is there. And I'm sure that Rothko was looking into that. So, and also the scale, which when we think about Rothko, we also think about the scale and how this openness of the scale of the canvases by Rothko at the very end of his career. But I've always looked to Guernica as a space for possibilities for the New York painters. So 40 years of stay, which I'm sure it was quite an event for them. a monument
yes.
in New York for painting and possibilities. So.
Yes. And certainly for all of that abstract expressionist generation, and there's so much evidence, for Pollock, for example, directly competing with them. It was interesting that Picasso said, he wasn't going to be defeated by the abstract expressionists, but they, particularly Pollock, felt he was not going to be defeated by Picasso. So, it was a two-way challenge going on there, really. But also for later American artists, James Rosenquist and his F-111 painting is really a response to Guernica, and which is a huge painting. It was as long as this wall, really. So they were very much challenged by that painting, on and on, throughout the time.
And also this relation you mentioned about photography, maybe Guernica was in a way, a mimesis for photography, the photography process of Dora Maar. I mean, the photography process that you see in newspapers, black and white pictures to depict drama, loss, Guernica, a place of death. So I guess many other generations took that as a possibility, because you think about Rosenberg and the use of printmaking and the newspapers, or you think about Warhol. There's a new exhibition now in Madrid, in Thyssen, Warhol, Pollock, and Estrella Diego was here. Estrella Diego was here, and she mentioned how she was developing this idea of this. So there's a huge relation between abstract expressionism and what happened later. So I wonder if you see Guernica as a point of, a joint, a point of departure, a point of dialogue between different generations in American art, not just abstract expressionism, but the generations that followed.
Yes, I think so. Abstract expressionism is a movement that's always there for American artists to respond to. It's the kind of the founding movement where they made it onto the world stage. So it's always something to reply to, and Guernica is at the source of it. So.
During the seminar, during these 5 Wednesdays, we've been answering the question, or maybe making the question to some of the keynote speakers about whether Picasso was or not a surreal painter, belonged to the movement. You say that very clearly in your exhibition and also in your lecture. He didn't belong to the movement in a way, but he was bypassing the movement through different ways. But I love the idea that you mentioned how he made this monument in order to create something that bypassed the ideas of surreal. Maybe he was looking for oneness. He was looking, it's a question, and maybe shared by Rothko, how they were creating a methodology and a project which was characterized by this oneness and this vision about creating a theme. So you cannot enclosure that into a movement. So it's a question that I made, or maybe opening up the question also to the audience. Is oneness and the unity of the work, as you portrayed it in the exhibition here, a way of avoiding the enclosement of Picasso in any movement, including surrealism? Do you think it's a way of protecting himself?
I think it was extremely valuable to him in the 1920s, as I tried to suggest, because he did appear to be someone who was no longer in the lead with the avant-garde. And this is what I was suggesting with Picabio's ridiculing of him in 1924. And by aligning with the Surrealists and having these young poets and writers proclaim him, it gave him a kind of rebirth that followed through the 20s. Because he had become so wealthy, so prominent, married to Olga, this very bourgeois life that he was living. And he clearly was worried about having lost his edge. And this was something that renewed it. And I think that's why he got so involved in the Apollinaire Monument, because he was recreating Apollinaire, renewing his legacy. But in doing that, he was also improving his own reputation. The two were really linked. So he was using surrealism in many ways, and very valuable, and contributing to it, because he really created the greatest visual images, I think, related to surrealism. But he was never entirely a part of it.
So it's funny to think that Picasso was a monument for a surrealist. I mean, the way he used Demoiselle de Avignon as a symbol for surreal painting, you portrayed it here, and you saw at so many images from magazines and articles where they depict Picasso as a figure. It was like a monument for the surreals, but at the end he made a monument about Apollinaire. It was like a way of departing from that idea, and I love it. I mean, I think it's a good way of seeing oneness. And in Rothko we see that also. I think he avoids this enclosement to the surreal movement and the surrealism through a holistic project where he wants to deploy this thematic, this mythology, this realness. The artwork as an artifact, and you mentioned that in your conference also, the realness of the work of art. And I think they both don't want to avoid that realness. And the surreals, maybe, the surrealist painters and artists, maybe they were creating something too oniric for both of them, for Rothko and Picasso. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you actually about something related to that with Rothko, because there's surrealism, clearly a movement that he was involved with, but not strictly following what Breton was promoting. But I also noticed in the images you showed us, for example, the slide from the Museum of Non-Objective Art of the Kandinsky exhibition, which for one thing is crazy. If you saw the way the work was hung, it was at shoe level, which is crazy. You just couldn't see the picture. But anyway, so Kandinsky's art was clearly widely admired, and he was interested very much in the spiritual, as his book, Concerning the Spiritual in Art, had been written earlier on, and also in the photograph of the group of artists in New York, there was Mondrian, also a spiritualist in his own way. So I'm wondering if you thought that was important for Rothko, that there were these two very different directions in contemporary, between surrealism and these searches for the absolute.
Well, it's a good question, because I think that Hilary Ray, when he founded this museum for Solomon Guggenheim and focusing on non-objective art from Europe and Russia and Kandinsky and Germany, I think from what I've studied Rothko, the reference to Kandinsky in non-objective abstract painting is not that important. And actually, one of the artists that he mentions is Picasso and Miro. And he says that after Picasso and Miro, everything changed. So I think his perspective about Kandinsky or Mondrian is not that important for him. I mean, he was looking more into the classics. He was looking for sure for the surreal movement as a way of point of departure. And Picasso and Miro, it was great to see that you were making such a reference to the surreal movement, something that maybe belongs too much to Spain, Buñuel, Miro. So I think that he was looking more into, themes that had to do with the realness and the themes, but that abstraction in a way that he was avoiding to be described as an abstract painter. He was a figurative painter, and he always said that. And I tried to say in my conference that it was not the elimination of the figure, but the substitution of the figure by something else. At the beginning, it was a biomorphic, then it disappears in a kind of multiform, and at the end, it's a complete use of color. But from my perspective, they do not have a relation with Kandinsky and many other abstract painters from Europe. I mean, they were too different. I mean, he was looking for the real. And maybe that's why he finds in the surrealist something that he takes advantage of. The biomorphic nature and the use of the myth, which he totally changed it. But I liked your question. And also I wanted to ask you about, we know that Picasso didn't move to the US. We could imagine how the history of art will have been affected by the stay of Picasso with the other artists in the US. Will have been a tremendous impact.
Yes.
But also in your exhibition, we see how Picasso developed new ways of creation during the Second World War and after Second World War. It was a celebration about freedom, and we see in the exhibition images of how the US Army visited his studio. I don't know if you can describe how he stayed in France. How did you imagine the effect of him being another exile artist in the US. I mean, just a trick of imagination. If you could make it, I don't know if it's too much for you.
It's hard to imagine, but actually he turned down 2 invitations to come to the US, first for the First World War and second for the Second World War, because his Kahnweiler he was working with as the First World War was beginning, and he had an arrangement with a gallery in New York, not a famous gallery, but as his agent in New York. And they suggested that Picasso send all of his work, and Kahnweiler send all of his inventory to New York to protect it when the war was starting. And they said, and Picasso, you can come too. And we'll put you up in New York, you'll have all your work here, you can work. Forget it. And they didn't send the work either. So, as many of you know, the history of Kahnweiler's gallery, it was all confiscated by the French government and sold in odd lots in the 1920s, and Cubism was, in a sense, shattered as a result. And then as the Second World War was coming, I found in the Picasso archive a cable from Nelson Rockefeller saying, please come to New York, we'll take care of you. And he never even replied. So clearly he didn't want to leave. I think he was so embedded, in the society and the culture in Europe, I don't think he could have adjusted or, would have wanted to try in any way. It was just too foreign to him. So I can't imagine it.
That's a good answer. So we'd love to open the dialogue. Nos encantaría abrir también el diálogo a los que estáis aquí. Queremos agradecer que en un día con tan...
Thank you for a day with so much rain, you being here. We're opening the discussion to the rest of the public. And we give you the floor so you can make questions and continue with the roundtable. If you have any questions, we are delighted to hear you.
Please.
Thank you so much, both of you, because this entire series has been fascinating. And we're ending with a superlative note. So I was just going to ask you, and I would agree with you, and I'm not an art specialist at all, but just because I was born in France and lived in the States, and now I've been many years in Spain, I would agree with you that I don't think Picasso would have been, probably not even tempted. He didn't answer. He was into something else very, very different. But it's a nice idea, hypothesis, right? What if? I would ask you, with my very limited knowledge, just because I've seen at the Musée Picasso in Paris, the prototype for you saw one of your slides. You showed the monument to Apollinaire, and the thing is, I think maybe at one point of time I was explaining, but I've completely forgotten the reasons why this never went through. Was it because it was the model itself? His wartime friends didn't like that. The configuration, the use of the materials. It was just too, I don't know, maybe ethereal, and they wanted something more solid. I don't know. Could you tell us?
If you have a couple of weeks, I can tell you the whole thing. But it was in constant evolution.
Yeah.
And the committee was a huge problem. They rejected the first one, and then they also rejected the very simplified linear structure. So that wasn't approved. Picasso went on to create a work called The Woman in the Garden, which is in the Paris Museum, which was a version, in a sense, a combination of those 2 earlier ones. But there was just no hope of resolving things with the committee. Ultimately, you might know there's a little bust of Dora Maar in the park next to Domago, so next to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. So that is the monument in Paris. Oddly enough, the true monument, and Picasso repeatedly said he wanted to do the wire constructions, the linear structure was his chosen version of all of these. And it was erected in New York in the Museum of Modern Art. It's in the garden there, sometimes moved back and forth. And it was because of Bill Rubin, who was then the director of painting and sculpture at MoMA, his relationship with Picasso, that Picasso gave him a sort of 5-foot version of that, which had been in his studio, and then Bill enlarged it by Picasso's instructions. Picasso took a stick and he went on the wall of his studio and he marked it should be this high. So he was measuring it in relation to his body. But it's there now, so, yeah. Anyway.
No sé si hay alguna pregunta más.
I don't know if there is any other question.
Surrealism is Spanish art. I thought that would get a rise from somebody. No?
Okay.
Can we vote?
Yeah, we could.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Michael. It's been such a privilege to have you here.
Thank you.
And it's great to have you as a curator for the collection show. Os invitamos a que veáis la colección. Me imagino que la habéis visto, pero...
I invite you to see the collection. It's wonderful to contemplate that unity of the work through the curatorship of Professor Michael Fitzgerald, and have it as part of the seminars that we'll have, international seminars that we will have promoted by the Center of Studies and Research and activated by the Department of Education of the museum. It's wonderful to have been able to make this dream a reality, and I want an applause for my team because it's been an immense amount of work, and we thank you all, and I thank you all for attending. And thank you all, as I said, as Maria Jose also said, the help with the interpreting, the sound technicians, the photography, the communication. It's a tremendous amount of work, and we are very, very happy with the achievement of 5 Wednesdays. At the beginning, we were really, really scared of being able to maintain content for 5 Wednesdays, but it's fascinating to enter the Surrealism through all these wonderful lessons and understand it in depth. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Muchas gracias y nos vemos pronto.
Bravísimo.